Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday for those joining in. Hey, Ben. Thanks for going on video right away. As people are coming in, feel free to also go on video if you're comfortable with it so that it's not just me and Ben hanging out. Cool to see people jumping in. So I'll just give it another minute or two before we hop in. For those of you just joining, I just said, feel free to go on video. No, not mandatory, but it's always more fun to see friendly faces. Maddie, it looks so sunny in Austin.
I'm actually visiting my dad on his ranch.
Oh, okay. Where's that?
It's about an hour northeast of Houston.
Okay, cool. I'm actually calling in from Utah today. First time in Utah, which is fun. Cool to see. It's great to see some new faces and also some people I recognize from last session. All right, well, we can get started. So each week, the material is going to be different. So the session, I guess, structure will also be different. So last time we did a couple intro polls and stuff like that. This time, I think we're just going to jump right in. This section is a little disjointed in that there's kind of like 4 or 5 things within the section that relate, but they're all about, they're all the things that you should consider before you're actually, starting your publication. And so just quickly before we jump in, curious to know, and you can either post in the chat or just speak up, who on this call currently has their publication up and running and they just want to maybe optimize things or switch platforms or learn how to write better, things like that. And then who is just getting started and is here to really know how to set things up from the ground up. Feel free to raise your hand, post in the chat, go off mute, whatever you guys want to do. You can see in the chat, Jake says, I have a publication on Squarespace, sad face. Lots of people saying just getting started. Some other people saying on Squarespace. Someone, Raj is on Substack. Okay, cool. So I think I mentioned this in the book, or maybe I didn't. Maybe I mentioned it on the last session. I helped someone who was on Squarespace set up their blog, and that was my first encounter with Squarespace publications, and definitely would recommend moving off of Squarespace if you want more functionality moving into the future. But we can get into that stuff later. All right, so I'm just going to jump in, but just throughout, we're a pretty small group here, so feel free to interrupt, speak up, say something doesn't make sense, because I'm happy to stop throughout. All right, so chapter 2, building your home. So let me present. All right, so chapter 2 is all about building your home. And as I said just a second ago, most of the other chapters are really centered around one unique thing. This one spans quite a few topics. So first we'll be talking about your core values. So really the things that you should be establishing before you're even starting a publication, or if you've started one, I think this is something that you should return to and establish. We'll also be talking about building your home. So your newsletter or publication stack, as you might call it. So between each of these sections, we'll stop for questions and audience thoughts. And then we'll be talking about if you're starting a publication, or even if you're thinking of pivoting your publication, should you be launching it paid or free? What are the pros and cons of each of those? And then we'll talk about writing. This is definitely the hardest thing to do if you're starting a publication. It's the bulk of what you would be doing, but it's also something that is a lot harder to teach. And really just comes from a lot of practice. So I'm happy to give my thoughts there in terms of how you can build a habit and things like that. But this is one where really, I don't really think anyone online that says I can teach you how to write perfectly is, really can quite do that. It really does come from a lot of internal hard work. And then finally, we'll leave some time for remaining Q&A. But as I said, if you have questions throughout, we can stop at any time. All right, let's jump in. So if you're starting a blog or you have started a blog, you probably already know this, but writing is this incredible tool that really can change your life. And if we go back to the lessons from chapter 1, it really does come down to this fact that the internet has given us this infinite leverage, which means that we really can reach anyone and anyone. And so if you imagine, this is just like a visual representation, but if you imagine on the left, you're this blue circle, and before you start to write, you have a circle of influence. You have people that know you, people that you interact with on a daily or weekly basis. But if you're not utilizing the internet, your bubble per se can only get to a certain size, right? And writing, especially online, does this amazing thing where it basically all it does is it completely changes your scope or your bubble in terms of who it can reach. And it, in many ways, if you're writing great things that share itself, it's doing this for you. It's expanding this bubble for you, even when you're sleeping or even when you're not actively at the computer typing, let's say. And so it can bring you, incredible things like, this book for me, meeting all of you. It can, it actually, in my particular circumstance, it brought me a job offer. That's actually how I got, I guess, scouted or found for The Hustle. That's how Sam found me. But it can do so many things. And so I'm not going to spend too much time convincing you of this. I think many of you, if you're on this call, probably are interested or keen to write online. But what I would also say is that writing is a long-term endeavor. So if we're imagining the same circle as your scope of influence, what we really want is this top view, right? Where you are starting out small if you don't have a publication or if you're not reaching anyone at this current time, and slowly increasing that over time. What we don't want to do is to, do certain things that maybe will increase your scope very rapidly, but in the end aren't sustainable, and potentially are negative in terms of how they represent you, your company, things like that. So we really don't want something like The Red where, you might balloon overnight because you did something maybe scammy or maybe just that wasn't repeatable. And then you see that die out very quickly. What we want is this blue. So really, if you're trying to write online, if you really do want to, quote unquote, change your life through writing, what we want is this blue, right? Not this red. And so that leads me to this concept of core values, which is something that I often see people miss. I think maybe people kind of establish them in the back of their heads, but I think it's really important to think through them and what core values are, and why it's important to think of them before you actually start writing or as soon as you can, is because if you don't define this, contract between you and your writers, that contract is effectively being established anyway, right? By the things you do. So the actions that you take, how you treat your audience, what you put them through or what you don't put them through. And so if you don't intentionally define this contract or these core values, they're going to effectively be set for you, or you're going to almost like accidentally set values that you maybe don't even want to be setting. So just to give an example, I always go back to products because I think they're easier for people to digest or compare. But Lululemon is a brand that's, ballooned in the last decade or so. And when people buy a Lululemon product, they also have expectations. There also is this kind of unspoken contract where when someone buys Lulu, they expect the product to be extremely high quality. They expect the fabric to feel great. They expect their, leggings or whatever they're buying to last a long time. And that's why they're willing to pay more, or that's why they're willing to be a customer of Lulu. Now, there are certain things that Lululemon as a company can do that won't really impact how likely it is for someone to buy their product because it's not part of this like contract. So examples are, this is an ideal, but let's say Lulu is a little late on their spring styles. That's not really integral to what Lulu's offering, and therefore, people can kind of get over that, right? That's not something that is breaking their contract. On the contrary, if Lulu decides to engage with a new supplier, let's say, and that supplier has horrible fabrics that itch, or maybe the fabrics, their leggings break after 2 months. Well, in that case, then that is something that really was part of this core contract. And if you're starting to break that core contract, then that is when you do lose people, right? You lose your customers. And the same thing is true if you're starting a publication. There are certain things that people, when they're engaging with you, when they're putting that email into your subscribe form, there are certain expectations, right? And so for me, some of the core values that I've come up with, and these don't need to be the core values that you come up with or that other publications come up with. For me, it's always been quality over quantity. It's always been prioritizing value creation over capture. And it's always been about not hiding behind a screen or not doing things that I wouldn't actually do in person. So I'll quickly dive into these, but this isn't necessarily about me. It's just to give you a little more color into how I thought about my 3 things. So just quickly, first one, quality over quantity. And so there's this great article by a guy named Ali Meese, and there's a quote that says, "I will publish an article only when I have something important to say." And that's kind of the core of this core value for me of I will not just put something online because it's time to publish or because, you know, I need to hit a certain number of articles per year. In fact, last year, I only published around, you know, you can see 15 or so articles here. I've published pretty much nothing this year. And it's because I'm only publishing when I really have something important to say. And I've mentioned this before, length certainly does not necessarily indicate quality, but it can be a proxy for it. And you can see these are the article reading times for my articles last year. You can say, with the exception of this one, they're all pretty long. And again, that doesn't necessarily indicate quality, but it indicates at least a proxy of I was only putting stuff out there when I really thought it was valuable. And when I was doing that, I was making sure that quality trumped quantity. I really only wanted to put things out there when I was proud of them. Now, the second thing, it was just creating value over capturing value. There's kind of some vague concept that, you know, so it's one of those things that sometimes feels like it doesn't actually mean anything. But what I meant here was that whenever I had done something that I found valuable, that I actually wished existed, I would put it out there. And I was very open with that. And so, for example, sometimes people do things and they think, okay, well, I now need to charge for this, or I don't actually want to share this because I just put in all this hard work and why would I share this with the rest of the world? I have this competitive advantage. I actually took the opposite approach where basically anything that I'd spent time on that would be valuable to anyone else, I put online. So just a couple examples. When I had figured out setting up a DigitalOcean droplet with Ghost, set up a tutorial. Same thing when I figured out how to integrate with the Google Sheets API, made a tutorial. When I had figured out how to pretty easily, or not easily, but practically find non-technical remote jobs, I wrote about that. After I'd learned to code for a year, I wrote about that. When I'd spent around a day finding the best Medium publications, I just put them all online. And so my goal, and this doesn't need to be everyone's goal again, was to create value. And eventually I would capture value in some way, shape, or form, but that wasn't really the core of what I was doing or trying to achieve. And the final thing is not hiding behind a screen. I think this is something that is almost just like human nature, where in person there are certain like group dynamics that stop you from doing certain things, right? Like you won't go sell someone a shitty product on the street because you're a little bit embarrassed to do that and you don't feel comfortable doing that and you know it's wrong. But for whatever reason, because we can hide behind screens on the internet, we're more willing to do things that I think we wouldn't necessarily be proud of, right? There are people who have sites that would not put their face on that site. They wouldn't attach their LinkedIn to that site. And I kind of, when I started my publication, wanted that not to be true, where basically anything I did online, I wanted to, you know, if I thought about it, I would do that in person, right? I would share my story about, you know, how I learned to code in person, and I have. And so what that really came down to is no promoting products that I didn't use or love. So no affiliates for things that, you know, could have made me much money, but I, you know, had never touched. No writing about topics that I didn't care about just because maybe they had a bunch of search volume or because I thought they could go viral. No advertisers that I didn't respect. So this is really core to me. Not everyone does this, I think, but it's a spectrum. So for example, Harry Dry was someone that I've been friends with for a while, amazing newsletter called Marketing Examples. And he's actually told me he doesn't do any affiliates. That's just something that he feels is, you know, the right thing for his audience. And I really respect that. He could make a lot of money through affiliates given his audience now. And so what I think this comes down to with all of these core values is that, you know, after this call, or if you've already done it, great. What you need to do is you need to write down all the things that you care about. So if you have your publication and, you know, there's all these things that you could do with your publication, all your goals. Maybe it's to hit a certain number of subscribers or page views. Maybe it's to hit a certain level of monetization. I'm just going to mute someone. Sorry about that. There we go. So it can be a bunch. There's so many things. Really, if you're doing this properly, there should be at least 10 things that you in theory, could care about, right? They can be very micro, right? Because it's anything that you could care about, not necessarily that you should care about. Then what you want to do is you want to map those out to what really matters and basically shuffle them so that the things that really are your non-negotiables, the things that matter more than everything else, rise to the top. And you really need to do this exercise to really put these things next to one another and say, you know, I really would love to hit this amount of, you know, revenue at this month, but I'm really not willing to do that at this cost. Or maybe you are, right? Maybe that, you know, monetizing is actually more important than something else. And so you need to put them again in contrast so that you can really identify what matters, because if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And then again, if you are not setting a contract for you and your readers, then it will be set for you. So with that said, like I said, we're going to stop at each kind of node within this. So if you have had a chance to set your core values for your publication, or if you're on the way to doing so, I'd love to hear what people have, you know, come up with there, or if you're still kind of trying to figure it out, if you have any questions regarding that, happy to answer them.
Steph, can I ask a quick question? That's
Yes, absolutely.
kind of separate. But with the growth, I was talking to a friend yesterday about Twitter and growing there, and he was saying how you should almost blitz it in the beginning until you get an audience, and then you can kind of coast more so off the compound. But that's less so the case with newsletters, as in you're breaking a promise if you go hard in the beginning and then kind of ease off the gas per se.
Sure. Sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead, finish your question.
Well, I was just gonna say, is that something you'd recommend not doing in newsletters in particular?
Well, so I think it depends what contract you set, right? So people often think that consistency is like the end all be all of publications or newsletters in particular, because you said you would send them weekly, let's say. Now, if you did make it very explicit that, you know, I'm going to send this thing every day and then you disappear, yeah, you are really breaking the contract that you set, because that was a core part of the contract. But for my case, for example, sure, when I start sending my newsletter again, I'm sure I'll lose some subscribers, but because that never was the core part of my contract, I won't lose my whole list. Now, if The Hustle, for example, their job is to send people daily news. And if they disappear, well, what are those people going to do? Those people are going to go look for someone else to supply their daily news. And if The Hustle, you know, reemerges in a month after, you know, going away, they're going to basically have lost all their subscribers, right? And so it really depends if the consistency and the like time frame that you agreed on with your readers, it depends how important that was, right? Like how integral that was to your contract. Does that make sense?
Mm. Yeah, maybe it's more relevant, I guess, to blog posts, and then the newsletter would be I don't know, that's usually on a daily or weekly basis, so it's harder to change that.
Yeah, just to give another example, so the guy from Wait But Why, he went a very long time. I think it was, I wrote about it in the book, I think it was like almost a year or something without publishing. And again, for him, his core thing with his audience was always that he provided like really interesting takes on things, right? Like if you've read any of his stuff, you're like, whoa, like I never thought about this way. His core relationship with his reader was never like, I'm going to show up in your inbox every day or every week. It was like, when I show up in your inbox, this is going to be really interesting and not like anything else on the internet. And so for him, disappearing for a year, when he dropped back after a year, I'm sure he lost some people, but for the most part, I bet you most of his list stayed on because he was never promising, right, that cadence before. And so again, it really just depends on what you kind of agree on, either subtly or very clearly with your audience, what they're expecting from you.
Thank you, Steph.
Oops. Yeah. I see some questions, maybe, or maybe not questions. Yes, I like Tim's comment, new post every sometimes. Yeah, exactly. I think that's what the Wait But Why guy says. All right, any other questions, thoughts? Anyone want to share the values that they came up with or are toying with? All right, then we'll move on. I think this might be the bigger section that people are here for. It's about building, right? So if you're moving on to build your digital home, you're going to need to set up some technology, although this is where I would actually advise people not to go and overthink things too much. So what you're going to need is simply a domain. You're going to need hosting. You're going to need a blogging platform or something to actually, have your, your articles on, something like Ghost or WordPress. Then you're also going to need an email service provider. So it's actually sending emails to your newsletter if you choose to have a newsletter. So MailChimp, things like that. You can use an additional modal software, something like OptinMonster, but if you're using any of the major ESPs like MailChimp, they will give you some technology. It's just not, it's because it's not the core of their offering. It may not be as good as something like OptinMonster. And then you should also set up some form of analytics. I'm happy to answer questions about any of these in a second. But the point I want to quickly make is that this is not even a full overview of the things that I mentioned on the previous slide. You can see there are so many applications that will help you start a newsletter, keep your newsletter running, that will basically help you in your journey. But what's clear here, and this is the same thing if you're thinking of creating an application, is that there's just so many options, and it can be really overwhelming. And I often see people going down a rabbit hole of being like, should I use Ghost versus Substack versus Review versus Medium? And then they spend weeks, or if not months, just like thinking about this topic and trying to find the perfect thing. And what the point I want to get across here is that this is true not just for newsletters, but again, for tech stacks, if you're building some sort of application. And what's really important to keep in mind here is that think of your favorite newsletters, and similarly, think of your favorite products or apps. You have no idea what they're built on. Maybe for a newsletter, you can scroll down to the bottom and see like, oh, this was sent with MailChimp or whatever. But you truly have no idea what their hosting is. You don't know if they're using Ghost versus WordPress most of the time. And similarly here, if you're using an application, like you don't know what the back end of Facebook looks like, or Spotify or Medium. These are all extremely successful companies, and you can see there's almost actually no similarities between these three companies, despite their success. And there's many, if people are familiar with tech, there's a lot of technologies here that many people would actually say are not the most optimal. Like PHP is a pretty old language. Bootstrap is, I use Bootstrap, and Spotify is still using Bootstrap. And so what's really important to keep in mind here is that you can go really deep if you're trying to find the perfect solution. If you're, building something, whether it's a newsletter or a fully fledged app, but it doesn't matter, right? You want to make sure you're staying away from something that will hinder you significantly. But most of the time, if something is pretty well established within a space, it's good, right? It does the job, and it'll do the job for you. And so you shouldn't spend too much time on finding the perfect solution. You should spend time on just picking something and then executing on what your job is, which is to create and distribute content. And then I think finally, before we move on to the question, don't compare your year 0 to someone's year 10. This is really important because, again, I think one of the things that there's this initial hump before you start anything that some people just simply don't get over. And most of the time it's for things that, aren't actually barriers. They're, things like, oh, I can't choose a stack, or like, I'll never be as good as XYZ company that's been around for years. And again, just to use products as an example, you can look at the first versions. There's a great site called First Versions that, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Wikipedia, YouTube, Twitter, all huge companies now, and their first versions look pretty awful, and that's okay. And they've, emerged over many, many years to look much better, to function much better, to do a better job at solving their users' problems. And that's exactly what you should do too. You should find something that's good enough at the beginning. And remember, you don't want to be switching stacks all the time, but it's okay if you do need to start with something and then eventually switch to something else later on. So I'll pause here because I'm not going to go through every single piece of technology for each of those 5 or 6 things that you need, but I'm happy to stop here, answer any questions. I know some people are on certain platforms. Sounds like you might want to switch. I saw Ben's comment, Bootstrap is still a thing. Yes, I still use Bootstrap as well. But see, you don't even know that certain companies are using Bootstrap. But I'll pause here. If anyone has any questions regarding tooling, switching tooling, how to think about tooling, anything like that.
Hey, Steph, it's Andrew here.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, good, thanks. Hey, everyone. So if you're going through this, making choices and saving up to get started, about how much should you try and save up and budget for?
So for newsletters or publications specifically, it's extremely cheap. So I think let's just go back to, let me just go back to the key things that you need. So a domain, my opinion on domains is that things like .coms matter much, much less now than they did, 5 years ago, let's say. And so you really, in my opinion, especially if you're first starting, don't worry about getting the perfect domain. You should not be spending more than $100, maybe max a couple $100. I never spend more than like $30 on a domain. And so let's say that's a one-time fee. I guess it's recurring annually, but let's say to start out, you need, let's say, $30 for a domain. Now, hosting is something that there are so many options out there. I mentioned this in the book, I'd stay away from certain things like GoDaddy, which tend to be more expensive. You can get amazing hosting from DigitalOcean. For example, my Droplet for Ghost, that's $5 a month. Hosting, at least at the beginning, you should be spending no more than, $20 a month. So we're at 50, right? Or actually $20 a month plus $30 in the beginning. Blogging platform. Ghost is, I would say, the most expensive to start out with if you are using their hosting, right? And so if you actually don't use their hosting, or if you use something like WordPress, it's free, right? It's free to use WordPress. It's free to use Ghost if you set up your own Droplet, which I'm happy to, if anyone has any questions about that, happy to answer them, or, you can shoot me an email after, because I've spent a lot of time setting those up. So yeah, blogging platform, pretty much free. Email service provider, this really depends on the size of your list. So it certainly can get expensive, but that's only once you have a big list. So a lot of people tend to start out with MailChimp for just the reason that it's one of the easiest to get up and running, and it's free up until 2,000 subscribers. So really, again, if we're talking about just starting out, this is, again, pretty much free, or maybe $5 a month, $10 a month if you're starting with something that's not free to begin with. Modal software, at the beginning, you don't even have to worry about this. I would only worry about this once you're up and running and optimizing. This is really an optimization thing. Analytics, to start out with, you can just use Google Analytics. If you care about privacy, you can use things like Simple Analytics, which do cost money, but again, not very much. So I would say, to begin with, you should be spending no more than, I would say on the very top end, $50 a month. And on the low end, you could be spending as little as like $5 a month, right? Just for your hosting. And then everything else is pretty much free to begin with, right? Because you have no subscribers. So does that help you get a sense of what you might need to save up?
It does, and certainly much cheaper than what I had in mind. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's very helpful. Thank you, Steph.
No problem. And like I said, in general, running a newsletter or a publication is really not expensive, especially if you're willing to set a couple things up on your own. But even if you're not, to start out, you should not be spending more than $30 or so a month.
I guess there's really no need to get the legal stuff, the articles of incorporation, shareholder agreement. I've done all that stuff, and it's like tens of thousands, and you obviously probably don't need any of that.
No, you don't. Legally, I mean, as long you should obviously be creating your own content, not plagiarizing anyone's stuff. And if you're doing that, obviously, if you're hiring writers, you need to have like the right legal contracts with them. But that's just like the same legal contracts that you'd set up with anyone that you employ. And then from there, yeah, you don't need to set up any sort of legal entities or things like this for your publication. If you do have a company, which I know you do, this would just be like an asset for your company.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Steph.
No problem. I can see some questions in the chat. So I can see Sam Parr mentioned starting with MailChimp, then moving to a custom solution. Do you know what this is, or can you recommend an ESP that can scale Scale, I think they meant with you, or is a custom solution the only answer after a certain volume? So yes, so The Hustle started with MailChimp. Trends also started with MailChimp, and then both have switched away, and I'll talk about both. So The Hustle switched to a fully custom solution that was built by our internal tech team. I would not advise that for 99% of people or publications, because The Hustle itself is a huge publication or a huge newsletter that needs to be really custom in how we actually facilitate advertiser placements. That's the only reason that, or maybe not the only reason, but a really key reason as to why custom has really helped us out. Now, if you're not really planning on going and hiring a sales team and filling all these ad slots, you don't need something that is this custom. Now, Trends, on the other hand, also started with MailChimp for a period of time. And then after a period of time, we moved to a tool called ActiveCampaign. And so ActiveCampaign is pretty expensive if you're an independent, but pretty good. We're actually soon moving to a tool called Sailthrough for both The Hustle Daily and Trends. But what matters here is, again, that it depends what you're optimizing for, right? So there's things like Sailthrough and ActiveCampaign are super powerful, right? Sailthrough in particular allows you to do a lot of customization. But if you're just sending an email, right? If you just have an email that you need to get out there, I would not use something like ActiveCampaign or Sailthrough. I would use something like Email Octopus, Mailjet. There's tons of options that are cheaper than MailChimp at scale. And if you're willing to pay, MailChimp really is still super user-friendly, and many people just choose to stick with them past the 2,000 subscribers because it's just really easy. And if you do know how to monetize your list, 2,000 subscribers, I think, starts around 30. It's either 30 or $50 a month. If you're really focusing on monetizing your subscribers, it's not hard to get that money back. I can see Jake commenting that SendFox is wicked. So I've never tried SendFox, but I have heard good things about it. So there really is an array of options, and it depends, like, are you optimizing for cost? Are you optimizing for the complexity of what the software offers? But I would say that if you don't have any sort of inherent complexity in what you're building, don't go with something super expensive. Many of these will do the trick, and just choose one that works for you. Tom was asking, what's a droplet? It's effectively like a server. You can even just kind of like replace the word droplet with a server. It's a server. So Ghost is open source, and Ghost, the way Ghost works is they have the technology, right, which allows you to publish. It has like the editor, and all of that is actually free if you have your own hosting, right? And so I actually, even though I love Ghost and I should be paying them something for all that they've done, I don't pay Ghost anything. I use Ghost and I hook it up to a $5 droplet or server on DigitalOcean. And DigitalOcean, droplets are kind of a specific term to DigitalOcean, I think, at least, where basically they set up these droplets, which they've actually put together that integrate very easily with these other technologies. And so if you were to try to integrate with Ghost on your own and set it up to, let's say, your own server or a server at another company, it'd be much more difficult, whereas DigitalOcean has basically customized a type of server that integrates very easily with Ghost. Yeah, it looks like I already answered Rashi's question.
Steph, could I ask something on analytics?
Absolutely.
So you mentioned you could just go with Google Analytics. What are the kinds of things that you want to be tracking? And if you're also selling a product, if you're using content to drive, so for example, the reason I'm interested in this is I've just created a digital course and I want to be sending traffic. I'm probably not going to have enough traffic to just work off organic, so I'm going to have to do paid. So I wondered what you would say is the minimum kind of required setup for analytics.
Yeah, great question. So I'm not going to pull up my analytics now, but I'll try to talk through it. So what you want to do is, for any channel that you are driving traffic towards, your content or a landing page, you want to make sure that you are using UTM parameters so that Google can recognize where the traffic is coming from. And the UTM parameters also allow you to not only say, is this traffic is coming from Google or Facebook or Twitter or wherever you're driving traffic from, but also you can add campaigns or specific other parameters that help you track like, oh, this is, you know, X campaign that I'm running through Facebook and I want to compare it to Y campaign. So you definitely want to make sure that, you know, at the very baseline, you know exactly where all your traffic is coming in from. And Google can recognize some of that on its own, but UTM parameters really help you get more granularity there. So from there, if you go into GA, you'll be able to see where your traffic is coming from. I can record a demo for people later if that's helpful and how you actually think about these things. But once you're in GA, the things that you want to care about are, first, you want to make sure that, you know, you have traffic and that's coming in, but then from there you want to break down the traffic and see how that traffic is performing. And there's two things. So one is on-site metrics, and the other, if you're selling a course, you want to set up goals. So Google will actually, in GA, will allow you to set up a goal. So let's say a goal could be, you brought in paid traffic to get to excellent, your course landing page. Your goal, which Google can track, is either them converting on that page, or you can also set up goals where it's like they got to the thank you page, which effectively means that they converted, right? Because you never get to the thank you page unless you converted. And so what you want to do is you want to, A, set up a goal if you have one, right? If you're just writing content, you may not have a goal, but if you're selling a course, you definitely do. And then you also want to make sure that you're checking your on-site metrics and you're checking them across channels, right? Because what you'll often see is the on-site metrics are things like bounce rate and time on site. Almost always for paid channels, those on-site metrics will be worse than something like organic, just because the intent of someone clicking an ad is different than someone actually searching for what you're creating. But you want to make sure those are relatively healthy and also that they're improving or at least stable over time. What you definitely don't want to see is, for example, I've seen this a ton throughout my marketing experience, where sometimes if you start paid advertising, you may be getting really, really cheap clicks with a new campaign. But if you go into GA and you actually see that before you were getting a bounce rate of 70% and now you're getting a bounce rate of 95%, that's actually really bad. And not worth, your clicks are basically not worth anything, even if they're really cheap. And so those are some of the things that you want to think about within GA and kind of like the baseline, so that you can track how people are coming in from what channels, how those channels are doing relative to one another, and specifically how they're doing with respect to the on-site metrics, and also if you have a goal, how they're performing relative to that goal.
That was awesome. Thank you very much. And I would love to see a demo of that. That'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, there's a couple questions from week 1 and 2 that I'll be recording after this, just answers to, so I'll include that. All right, I can see if
Can I
anyone
ask
has...
one quick question?
Yes.
So just similar to, like you mentioned, Squarespace might not be the best. I'm just thinking about, I don't want to overthink it, but I'm thinking about it from the other side with just constraints.
Sure.
So are there platforms that you just straight up are no's, or you definitely don't recommend?
Yeah. Yeah, so for each of these, I mentioned them in the book. So for hosting in particular, I would stay away from GoDaddy, Bluehost. There's a couple that I mentioned just because they're actually just, they're not as focused on building great technology. They're actually more so affiliate companies where they get a bunch of bloggers to go say go buy Bluehost and it's great. And they're really not great technologies. But for hosting, there are many great options. DigitalOcean is one of them. But if you look in the book, I talk specifically about hosting, and many of these, I think the question that you were mostly talking to is the blogging platform. And there are also, for this in particular, yes, there are things that I would stay away from. So the ones that I would specifically recommend are Ghost and WordPress. And the reason for that is, so I'll speak to each individually. So Ghost in particular, because if you think about within the spectrum of companies, something like Squarespace or Wix, their job is to create just generally a good site builder, right? But that's a good site builder across e-commerce, across direct conversion landing pages, it's across blogs, and across that spectrum, they are just naturally investing less resources in each of those individually. And so they're a good solution, generally, but they aren't spending very much time optimizing for actually a good publication. And also, something like Ghost is not only spending more time here, but because they're only focused on this, they're experts in that one particular thing. And so I personally had a really good experience with Ghost. Now, the other one is WordPress. So WordPress has powers so much of the web, and actually many publications that you probably don't know are using WordPress are. So things like TechCrunch, they use WordPress. And so WordPress, even though they don't focus on one thing, because they're so big and they've been around so long, and they also are open source, they're basically they've kind of been able to catch up or to simultaneously do many things well. Now, some of the newer players like Squarespace, they're not new, but newer in terms of their relevance. Squarespace, Wix, again, they're general site builders, and from my experience, they just really don't do content well. They, in particular, so I actually worked with someone who set up a Squarespace blog, a Squarespace site overall, and part of it was a blog, and it looked really nice. But as soon as we actually went in to create articles, there were so many limitations, very obvious limitations, like we literally couldn't put in, certain images. We couldn't put in like any sort of custom code or snippets, or even like if you see on certain articles of mine, like I'm able to embed tweets. You cannot do that with Squarespace. And so if you're really just looking to put just plain text article, Squarespace can do that. But we ran into limitations super, super, super quickly. And again, just in terms of, if you think of even moving into the future, Ghost's promise or Ghost's mission is to go work on publishing and make their publishing tool really amazing, versus Squarespace is doing a whole bunch of things. And so maybe their publishing tool may get better, but that's not their priority. And so I would choose something where it is a priority. And for me, that has been Ghost. I think WordPress is also good, but those are the only two that I would strongly recommend across the spectrum of tools, potential blogging platforms.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, you see people, basically say like no Wix or no Squarespace, but I just couldn't tell if that was like similar to how people kind of, say PHP is like the worst, but then again, there's like
yeah.
Facebook and Peter Levels, and they're just like, oh, I just have one PHP file, so I couldn't tell if it's just like, them people being like snobby about it, or if they're like actual reasons. But no, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Totally. And no problem. And yes, I also am very like wary of, when you hear don't use these platforms. That's why in general, I would say the way I view this, matrix is most things work. In the book, I call out a couple things that I would just stay away from, just because they really are limiting. It's not me, sticking my nose up at certain tools. I just think that I personally, when I actually set up this site for the guy on Squarespace, I at first was really impressed. I was like, wow, like I haven't actually used Squarespace and this is amazing. And I even remember, telling friends about it, being like, wow, like Squarespace is awesome. But as soon as we actually went into publish, it was super, super limiting. I can see a couple questions in the chat, so I'm going to go through them. I can see, let me scroll back up and go through them in order. All right, I can see Michael is asking benefits of Ghost versus Webflow. Have you also ever duplicated posts on Medium to get organic traffic? Yeah, so I'll answer those two individually. So Ghost versus Webflow, I will say I haven't used Webflow myself for publishing in particular. I would give kind of a similar answer where, from what I've heard, Webflow is better than Squarespace and Wix in this area, but it's still a company that's focused on many things, of which publishing is just one of those things. And Ghost is focused on one thing, and they do it extremely well. I always like to say, and I know this sounds like an ad for Ghost, but I don't work for them. I don't have, there's no affiliate link that I'm sharing right now. I use them, and I kind of compare them to, so their editing interface is very similar to Medium. It's very clean. But at the same time, you own your stuff. So unlike Medium, you own your stuff. It's also very developer friendly if you are a developer and you want to make any sort of customizations. And one of the underrated things about Ghost relative to even WordPress is their SEO is amazing. It's built on Node, so it's much faster than WordPress or many of the other sites, and that matters with SEO. And so certainly not the only solution, but if you really are asking for my like number one recommendation, it is Ghost. I can see people saying the demo would be good. I'll record that. Dylan's asking, should you switch from Bluehost if you have it already? The hosting side of things isn't critical in that if you're on it, finish your term there and then switch. I have heard of some people who were on Bluehost that have had their sites hacked. If you're just starting, I don't think that's really too much of a like concern. But I would say, like, let's say you have 3 months left on Bluehost, you can stay on Bluehost, but I would just not renew there, and I would renew somewhere with better hosting. Tim is asking, would you still recommend Ghost for a blog and podcast? So something to keep in mind is I'm not sure where people, where Tim, you're hosting your podcast, but what you can do, because one thing to keep in mind is Ghost, because they focus on publishing, that's all they do, right? So Ghost does not help you set up a direct conversion landing page. If you go to my personal site, the homepage is not built on Ghost. It's only blog.stephsmith.io. Everything else on stephsmith.io is not built on Ghost. And so what I would recommend is that Ghost you use for publishing, because that is what they're good at, and in fact, all that they do. And then everything else you can easily set up on either, you can either set up the podcast on the subdomain or the blog on the subdomain, but you can set up anything outside of your core publishing, outside of Ghost, and have it all still be on the same domain. And that's what I would recommend. So Bill is asking, how do you feel about ConvertKit? I've heard really good things about it. I don't personally use it, but of the tools, the ESPs that I've heard of, it's one that is very consistently recommended, and I think has a good balance between not being crazy expensive, like things like ActiveCampaign or SailThrough that I was mentioning, but also having one of the fullest feature sets of ESPs that I've seen. So again, don't use it myself, so can't necessarily promote it or get behind it, but I have heard really good things from others. Those are, I think, all the questions in the chat, but if anyone has any other additional questions, happy to answer them. Okay, I'm going to keep moving then, and we'll move on to the next section, which is paid or free. So now if you're going and you're starting your publication, the next question tends to be, should I charge for my content or should I not? And there is no right answer here, but it really depends on what your goals are. But before even getting into your goals, you should have a good understanding of what the pros and cons are for each of these, and also where we are in kind of this content trajectory and why people are suddenly willing to pay for content and when. And so if we look back, or if we even go back to the last lesson, for a long time, for several decades, people haven't been willing to pay for content, with the exception of things like newspapers, certain mediums that people are used to paying for. And if we actually go back centuries, this is when things shifted, when basically certain people realized that they could sell other people's attention. So instead of selling them products, they realized they could be an intermediary between someone and the products that someone was trying to sell those people. So they were selling their attention. And this started way back when. This actually maybe isn't exactly when it started, but this is an inflection point, certainly, when in the 1800s, there was a newspaper called the New York Sun that basically recognized that it could do this, and it started to sell its newspaper at 1/6 of the price of its competitors. So completely changed the game, and basically since then people have come to recognize or come to expect that content should be free. But there was kind of an underlying current more recently that I think has changed the game, at least to some extent, where basically the supply of content has increased. We know this because the barriers to putting content online have decreased. And basically now we're at a point where we actually have more content than we could ever wish for. And the dynamic that has shifted is that often we don't have time to consume this content. And then kind of alongside that, this ad-based attention model that has really run rampant for, the last couple decades at least, has kind of struggled to hold up because people have recognized that really what an ad-based model is an intermediary. Again, it's, there's someone who wants to sell someone else a product, and they could be very directly connected or there could be this intermediary where people have, are basically selling others' attentions. And there's really, people are starting to recognize this divergence in the model of, providing value and monetizing, when really those should, at least in an ideal world, be more connected. So if we look at these two images, imagine that you are interested in these blue circles. These circles represent content. And let's say you're only interested in these blue circles. If we go back before we had this surge of basically unlimited content, it was very easy to identify what you wanted, and a free model made sense because, I know I can see these 5 different pieces of content. I know which one's best for me. I'm going to engage with this blue content and ignore all of this. This is kind of visually a better representation of where we are today, where if you're interested in the blue circles, it's much harder to find them. There's a couple in here, but I don't know how to find them. They also look a lot more like other things because there's so much content, and certain stuff may be the topic I'm looking for, but may not be high quality, let's say. So it's just much harder to find the things that you want to find. And so for that reason, at least some people are willing to pay for content, and they're willing to pay for content if it's higher quality, more actionable, more specific. Basically, if we remember from the first lesson, if it's better, right? If it's more of the thing that they need, and they're actually willing to cut through the noise to get there. Similarly, if they want to win back their time, again, we're now in a place where you have unlimited access to content. What you don't have unlimited access to is your time. And so some people are willing to pay for that. And then finally, it's certain people that are willing to fund a specific thing, either a type of journalism. They've recognized this, this disparity between people selling their attention and how certain journalism is being monetized, or they just want to support a specific individual or type of organization. And you can see a couple examples of certain paid publications that have emerged in the last decade that are doing very, very well for these reasons. Each of them probably play to a different reason on here, but they play to one of these reasons very specifically. So before moving on and talking about the pros and cons of paid publications, how to think about pricing, stuff like that, just curious to know of the people on this call, what paid newsletters do you subscribe to, and curious to know why. Feel free to use the chat too if you don't want to speak up. You can see the trends report from Drew Riley. Maddie's saying, a couple of people on this call saying trends. That's always great. Obvious disclaimer, I work for Trends, so I'm biased. But yeah, I think it's important to realize here that if you, this sounds obvious, but if you subscribe to a paid publication, it needs to be significantly more, or more is actually not the word I should use. It needs to be significantly better in one direction in order to play to one of these things. You can see Pomp Letter, Michael Simmons, Mental Models and Trends. Chris is actually saying Medium. That's awesome. That's interesting. I haven't heard of too many people subscribing to Medium recently, but that's great. Supporting paid journalism. What I think I would also call it here before moving on is that in the past, in the previous lesson, I mentioned that people are not monogamous with their content. But I would say they tend to be more monogamous with their paid publications in that, again, if there's free publications and you're subscribed to 3 amazing publications about stock picking, let's say, and there's a really great 4th one, you'll add the 4th. However, just because of pricing considerations and people's budgets, they do tend to be more monogamous with their paid newsletters in that it's very rare for someone to pay for 5 paid newsletters. And so you really do want to make sure that you are really, really good at one of these things, because if not, it's much harder to actually be a paid publication. I'll actually jump into some of that now. And so the paid pros and paid cons. So again, it really depends on what you're trying to achieve, but the paid pros are really that you are closing that value monetization gap, right? So what you're providing to your customers is what you're selling. You're not selling their attention. And if you continue to provide stuff that is of value to them, they'll continue to pay, versus that not being always true with a non-paid newsletter approach. There's also, because of that, more accountability. So again, if you don't if you don't keep your contract, if you don't create the things that you said you would create, or the reason that got someone to purchase your content in the first place, they will stop buying it. There is that very direct relationship between the value you're providing and what someone's going to pay. Because of that, it also validates ideas very quickly. So if you have an idea and you're unsure of if this actually provides value to the world, quickest way to find out is to see if people are willing to pay for it. Versus if you create something unpaid, again, people are not monogamous, so people are willing to pile stuff up in their inbox, even if it's not providing that much value to them. And then finally, paid newsletters can sometimes serve niches well that large unpaid newsletters would certainly not be able to even exist. And just to give an example that I talk about later, there's this paid newsletter called the Iraqi Oil Report. Now, there are only a certain number of Iraqi oil executives in the world that would pay for this report, but also that just exists. And so if you went with an unpaid option for your content there, it just wouldn't make sense from a structural perspective, because unpaid content, you need a certain volume for it to make sense. If we move on to the paid cons, speaking to what I just mentioned, you lose distribution vectors. So your value that you're providing is your content most of the time. And if you're using a paid newsletter option, you're losing a distribution vector because your core value is hidden behind a paywall. Now, that's okay sometimes, but that's something that you really do need to keep in mind. And similarly, you need to keep in mind that your ceiling will be lower. And by ceiling, I don't mean the money that you can make. I specifically mean the people that you can reach. And so, for example, with a paid publication, down here, you can see, this may be hard to see, so I can speak through some of it. This is actually the daily visitors for the most popular Substacks. And these numbers are not small at all, but remember, these are the absolute best of the entire platform. And you can see very quickly, I think there's around, 30 to 50 on here. We're going down to like 1,000 to 2,000 page views a day, which again, isn't small, but is certainly not a lot compared to the entire spectrum of websites out there and the traffic that those websites get. And so you really want to consider, what am I trying to do? So for example, some people with their publications, their goal is actually to build their personal brand. Now, you can do this with a paid publication, but just remember, if you're gating your content, you are limiting the number of people that you can build your brand with, for example. And I liken this to the concept of VC or bootstrapping, right? So with VC, you're basically willing to trade off something in the interim. You're giving away some of your equity with the potential to grow into something that is much more sizable. Versus bootstrapping, you're not willing to do that, and you want the whole thing to be profitable from the beginning, but that also by nature limits potentially the scale that you can get to. The same thing is true, I think, with paid and free publications. And then finally, or I guess two more things, if you choose to use Substack, for example, which is the most popular, I would say, solution for paid publications, you're going to run into walls. I'm not saying Substack is bad, but you're going to run into walls in the things that you can do because it is an out-of-the-box solution. And then finally, as I mentioned, people are not monogamous with their free content, but they tend to be more monogamous with their paid content. And for that reason, you must be a painkiller, right? With that framework of being a vitamin or a painkiller, you really must provide a solution that people need if you want to create a paid publication. Now, there is the potential of at least somewhat getting the best of both worlds. And what I mean by that is there's really two options here. The first is actually starting out free with the intention of moving to paid at some point in time. So you're really starting to build an audience if you don't have one. Something else to keep in mind, if I go back to the prior slide, many of these people, which may be hard to see, came with an audience to Substack. So Matt Taibbi, he was like a very well-known reporter before moving to Substack. Pomp had his own audience on Twitter and I think elsewhere before he moved to Substack. And so if you don't have an audience, you can start by focusing on that first, building your audience, keeping things free and open so that you're actually able to build your audience. The value that you're providing is freely shareable throughout the world, freely recognizable. You can nurture that audience, and then at some point in time, select a date for conversion based on your goals, and then either convert partially or fully. Partially meaning that you still leave some of your content open. Fully would mean that all of it, of course, goes behind the paywall. So this is one option. And it's really important, I think, if you don't have an audience, that you consider these options, because again, it's very hard to grow a paid publication if you don't come with an audience and all of the value you're providing is stuck behind a paywall. The other option is kind of from the beginning having a hybrid approach, which means that you have some free content and you have some paid content, and the free content basically helps bring people in, helps build your audience, helps grow your audience, and then you nurture those people into paid. Now, the thing that people often get wrong here is that when they do this, they think that basically what they just go create something that's free, and then their paid version is more of that thing. Now, if we remember the dynamics that have brought us to where we are today in terms of content, there's already a lot of content out there. What people don't need is more content. What people need is better content. And this is why people approach this incorrectly often in just saying, hey, here's 3 articles within the free version, I'll give you 5 within the paid option. People don't really often want that 5. They want, a better 3, let's say. And so what you need to do if you are doing this hybrid approach is clearly delineate between free and paid. And there's many examples of how people do this. Just one that I know well is Trends. Trends, the daily starts as being the solution for people who want the daily, tech and business news. But for the people that actually want to start their own businesses, who want to know how to start their own businesses, who want to get ideas for starting their own businesses, they can't get that within the daily, and they have to pay for that with Trends. One of the better ones that I've seen is Rocket Ship Jobs, or basically this guy, Henry, he provides people with information about companies that they may want to apply to or join, that basically would be rocket ships, right? Like these companies that you'd want to join early, get equity at, and really ride that wave. And so what he does with the free version is he basically gives people information. He shows people the jobs, but then the paid version is basically him saying, hey, here are a bunch of resources that will help you actually get the job. So here's the connections with people who work at the company. Here's some additional information about how you might think about applying to this job. And so again, it helps delineate between the free and paid content, but still relates them in a way that connects the free subscribers to wanting to move to paid. And then finally, the thing I would mention here is that as you're doing this, make sure to consider the perceived value of what you're offering and the type of information that you're offering. So the example I like to give is, if we remember, 5 years ago even, it was very rare that people were willing to pay for iPhone apps. And that wasn't because the iPhone apps were any less useful or valuable, but there was a perceived value. For whatever reason, people thought 99 cents was too much to pay for an iPhone app because we weren't used to paying for it. And so now we are, but that's 5 years later, let's say. And so you do want to keep in mind that you really don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to shift people's opinion on what they should be paying for, because that's a very hard endeavor and one that normally takes a lot of time. So you really want to focus on things that people generally have already gotten their heads around, that they're already willing to pay for, and starting there. And then finally, I'll just quickly talk to pricing, because this is something that people often ask about. And if you do choose to go with paid pricing for your content, it really is kind of arbitrary. And so many people who start on Substack, they start at $10 a month. I think that's the most common price point, but it really is arbitrary. And there are paid publications like the Iraqi oil report that I mentioned that charge thousands of dollars a year. And Holloway's another great example. They write technical guides, and they charge anywhere from $35 to $100 for their content. And so it really shouldn't be about necessarily what everyone else is doing, and it shouldn't be about how long it takes you to create the content, but it really should be about the value that it brings to the person purchasing it. So to use the Iraqi oil report as an example, these oil executives, if they're able to, get certain information that they can't get anywhere else, that could earn them millions of dollars. It could completely change the way they operate their businesses. So for them, the $2,000 a year is actually very appropriate. Now, if that isn't true, where the value that you're providing can't really provide a tangible change for someone, maybe you shouldn't be pricing your content at all, or at least price it to what is relevant or relative to the value that you're providing. And then again, the closer you are to providing value to that a reader can actually quantify themselves, the easier your sale will be, because you're not trying to convince them of something or change their view on something. It fits within their current framework. So quickly, just a summary of this paid or free section is just to reflect, and I encourage people, if they are toying with this question, is just to ask yourself some of these questions. So how easy is it for my reader to quantify the value that I'm providing to them? Am I a painkiller, or am I, really a vitamin? And be honest with yourself. It's okay if you're some form of a vitamin, but just that should influence your decision potentially to go free or paid. Am I trying to convince a large brand, am I trying to build a large brand, or am I happy with being a smaller newsletter with a more involved readership? Again, similar to if someone is deciding whether they should, take VC funding or if they want to bootstrap, that heavily influences the trajectory of your company. And so similarly with a newsletter, consider what am I really trying to build here? What scale will I be happy with? Because that really is influenced very heavily if you choose to get your content or not. Do you need to monetize now? Are you dependent on your newsletter, or are you okay having things open at the beginning or maybe forever, because you'll find a way to monetize in the future? Or do you need to monetize today? How used to paying are people for this type of content? How willing is the audience to pay for this current type of content, and how confident are you in that? And then do you know how to extend your offering in some way to delineate from what you currently might offer for fee? Oh my gosh, I can't talk today. For free, that you would extend to paid. And if you do choose to get your content, do you know how you would actually end up scaling? Because again, the value that you're providing is behind the paywall. So you must actually have a game plan there, whether it's that you already have an audience or you have a way that you believe that you can build an audience. So apologies for stumbling over my words there, but this is the end of the paid or free section. So I'd love to know if people currently run or plan to run a paid or free publication, why they chose to go that route, if they choose to change it, and also happy to answer questions about this.
Steph, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I follow Sam Harris. He has a podcast, Making Sense, and basically he'll have like the first 30 minutes or so free, and then the rest is gated. Is that like a good best of both worlds, or what's your opinion of that type of content for newsletters?
Yeah, so I think Sam Harris is a great example of where, he came with an audience. And so he's able to do things, I think, that sometimes people, who don't have an audience would be less successful with, right? So if you created, let's say no one knows who Steph Smith is, I want to create a podcast, and I just put a podcast out there, and I give them the first 30 minutes, and then the rest is gated. It's much less likely that they're actually going to go and engage and pay for that second gated part than they are with Sam Harris, because they know him and they want everything that Sam Harris does, right? It is something that you can do, and it is kind of like that, best of both worlds situation where you give them a taste. But in that case, if you don't have really any clout, that taste has to be really, really good, right? For someone to want to engage with it. What I would probably do if I were you is to build up some of that clout first, right? So have everything open at first if you can afford it, right? If you're not needing to monetize right away, and build up a really awesome podcast that people can get behind. And then in the future, once you have a base of people, that's when you can start adding like additional sections. And speaking to what I was saying before, where you want to delineate, I wouldn't just like cut the podcast in half. What I would do is say like, okay, I can't remember exactly the premise of your podcast, but like you do something for most of your podcast, and then maybe you have like a special Q&A at the end, or maybe you have a special guest, and any special guests are behind the paywall. I think it is really important that you delineate in some way, and not just have like, some of the content in front of the paywall and some of it behind the paywall.
Yeah, that's interesting, because he basically is just the next hour or so of the conversation, and unless there are clear topics that are different, it's not as appealing, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, Sam Harris is someone with a huge following and he can do things successfully that unfortunately I think may work for other people, but I would argue that they probably would not work as well for someone like you or me. And if we're really trying to get to like what will work most optimally for someone who doesn't have an audience, I would say first build up your audience. And then, you know, if you choose to gate certain things, I would say that you should delineate between what's free and what's paid.
Awesome. Thanks, Steph.
No problem.
I have just something to throw out there. I
Yeah.
do agree with what you're saying. I've noticed a lot of success with Starter Story that Pat Wall started,
Yeah.
and he doesn't delineate between his free and paid from what I can tell. I'm curious if you're familiar at all with Starter Story and why you think it's working for him in that case.
Yeah, so I think Starter Story took an approach similar to something like Business Insider, where basically he doesn't delineate, but he says you have X amount of free stories, and then you know, after that you like don't get access at all. And so I think that works if you have enough of an audience, so enough people following you, again, where if you're just at the beginning, no one knows who you are, no one has read your stuff before, then you know they hit the paywall and they're like, well, I'm okay not having access to the fourth article here. But I think Pat has done relatively well with his publication because he was free for a very long time, and then after a while, after people kind of knew what Starter Story was, had engaged with it before, were okay to go beyond the paywall after reading a certain number of articles. And I think in general, I would also caveat that Pat is doing super, super well, but I believe most of his revenue doesn't come from those paid subscriptions. I think it mostly comes from advertising. I love what Pat's doing. I think he's awesome, but I would say that that I think he would actually do better if he did delineate.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. I can see some comments in the chat. Yeah, Chris, great points. Chris is saying there's a gardening newsletter, it's free. And then it does not make people money or save them time, but it's a huge audience for advertisers. Totally agree. And then a real estate investing newsletter is paid because it very clearly saves people a lot of time, sets them up to make higher returns. Exactly. Jake is asking, is getting off Squarespace a must? I moved from WordPress years ago. I like that it's easy and I can just write and publish. Remember constantly updating plugins and got hacked on WordPress. Okay, so it depends. Like I said, if you're okay just writing plain text, for example, Squarespace will do the job. But I personally, when I was trying to help that guy on Squarespace, we ran into so many issues so quickly. What I would recommend, because I can understand that WordPress is very daunting, and I personally we use WordPress at The Hustle, but I've never used WordPress for my own sites because I also find it very daunting. What I would recommend is that you have your entire site on Squarespace, like at jakedenham.com, and then you have blog.jakedenham.com on Ghost or WordPress. But basically you use a platform that's good for publishing just for your blog, and then everything else, because I do think Squarespace is very good at many other things. I just think publishing they're not good at. So that's what I would recommend. I can see Scott is saying planning to be free as well, mostly because it's about increasing the sphere of influence for me. Like Steph said, it's been a great way for others to find their tribe, and I like to do the same. Oh, sorry, Michael, I totally missed answering your second question earlier. So yeah, have you ever duplicated on multiple sites for organic traffic? So yes, I mentioned this in the book, but basically what I think Medium is it's a distribution channel. Some people use Medium as their core publishing platform. I do not recommend that because in the end, you don't own any of that. And not only do you not own your subscribers, but you don't really control, it's everything is done through the Medium algorithms. You don't even control when people see your stuff. So I don't recommend publishing on Medium, even though it's got a beautiful user interface. What I do recommend is publishing on your own platform, regardless of what you're using, and then importing to Medium. Medium has very great importing tools. So you can just, there's a button on Medium that says like import story. You add the URL in there and then it imports everything right away. And so that's what I would recommend. Now Medium, I don't really think is actually that great of a place to bring in organic traffic, because again, even if you opt into their paywall, Medium controls how many people see it. And even though Medium has a great DA, I don't really think that that's the best place for you to get links or build up an organic traffic foundation. What you should be doing that for is your original site. So yes, post on Medium, but not for the reasons, not for organic traffic, not for traffic overall, but just because it's another distribution channel. No problem. Any other questions about paid, free, or anything that we've discussed so far? All right, I think we've got one more small section, which is just about writing. So again, I will not teach you to write, unfortunately, but that's because it really is the hardest part of creating an online publication, and it's something that no one can really teach you in a couple weeks or even a couple of months. It's something that you must, just like other skills in life, build throughout time. If you are starting out, I would encourage you to do whatever you can to build a habit. And what I mean by that is normally there's a hump with any skill where it's just very difficult at the beginning. And so you can benefit at the beginning if you're struggling to get over that hump by setting more rules or strategies to actually get you to show up at your keyboard and write or type. And so that might include, like Andrew Chen, who works at Andreessen now, he talks about how he would just set time aside every Sunday, add a blank piece of paper, and just write whatever it was, even if it was completely shit. So find your version of that if you're first starting out. But if you're past that hump and you already enjoy writing and you're already naturally inclined to write, I don't think there's as much need to set up kind of those regulations or things that force you to do it. But I would say find a cadence that works for you. And that cadence should really be tailored around this concept of making every at-bat count. And what I mean by this is remember, throughout the last two sessions, we've talked a lot about how quality matters a lot. And quality, again, is not just length, it's satisfying the user's need. And so if you are writing articles and an article is a 9 out of 10, let's say the bar hypothetically is an 8 out of 10 in this case. If you're writing an article that's a 9 out of 10, well, yeah, you made the most of your at bat. If it drops down to 3 out of 10, even if you didn't spend much time on that time is effectively wasted, because it's not going to be seen or shared or distributed online, because people only really engage with stuff above that quality threshold. The same thing if you even write a 7 out of 10 article. So you really want to make sure that you're optimizing the time and investment that you're putting into writing, into stuff that really is above this, kind of arbitrary but important threshold of quality that people will actually engage with. And you also want to keep a long-term horizon. Remember what I said earlier, consistency is helpful. It's important, but it's not the end-all be-all. It's actually, in my opinion, much more important to be really good at what you do versus very consistent in terms of timing and when people hear from you. So yeah, that's, I think, the only thing about writing. And so before we go into a quick summary of the session, any questions about writing or anything related to this topic that you guys want to chat about?
I would love to know about your processes for validating quality. Let's say someone's not on an editorial team with a bunch of people that can actually help with formal editing processes. Did you ever create an accountability group with other writers that are just doing things for fun?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it is much easier if you're working with a team and they can give you feedback. Some people do form one-on-one writing buddies that can provide feedback. What I think is important to clarify here is that quality is important, when it comes to grammar and things like that, like classic writing competency. But what I mean more so here is that you're writing about stuff that people care about, and it's solving a problem. And the best way to actually make sure that you're doing that is not arbitrarily saying I need to publish every week, because if you're publishing every week, you may not have a high quality idea every week. But instead just focusing on, if we talked about this in the last session, but focusing on what you're really good at, where your expertise actually lies. And if you focus on that and start there, then that you're actually providing value to people versus if you're just, vaguely talking about things that you think people might find interesting. It's possible that you write a very high quality article as it relates to it being deeply researched or it being, having beautiful prose or something like that, but not actually solving anyone's problem, right? And so my advice to anyone who's really trying to make sure that they're writing high quality material is just to start with what they know best, because you are then coming from a place where you can actually discern if something is high quality or not without having to rely on other people. Now, again, you can certainly set up accountability groups, writing groups. Those are great. But I'd say even prior to that, focusing on something that you know super well is like a prerequisite, if that makes sense. All right, any other questions about writing, building a habit, anything like that?
I've got a quick one, Steph. I guess
Sure.
I preface that every time, but with writing, say you mentioned Wait But Why, and they have, book length posts. Tim Urban does sometimes. So would you recommend maybe chunking it into smaller pieces and releasing it like over time so you can get more feedback or something like that to get a better sense of quality, what people want?
It's a good question. I think I really, in general, haven't been a big fan of posts that end up coming in series, because you basically want to give someone as much as you possibly can. Like, you want to engage them as much as you possibly can while you've got their attention, right? And so what I found with when posts are broken up is, like, you might have someone's attention and they might be in the right mind frame to be like, wow, this is really interesting. This is really helping me. And even if that's true and you've captured their attention that first time, if you break up a post, it's just harder to get their attention back, right? And if you're breaking up a post, that it means that you're not fully delivering the points that you wanted to in that first session. And so what I would focus on is I wouldn't break up posts, and I would focus, if you're worried about your post being too long, just focus on how can I articulate the core points of what I'm trying to articulate in the shortest possible post. Because again, length is maybe a proxy for quality, but length can also be overwhelming. Length can be time consuming when you're writing it. So I would just focus on what is the core thing that I'm trying to get across, and I would not break up an article into multiple posts. I think someone like Tim Urban can do that because, again, he's got an audience, and that audience will engage with everything that he says. He doesn't need to work on this concept of recapturing someone's attention. But if you're earlier on, that's something that you should keep in mind.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, I'm gonna move on then. Just do a quick summary, and then happy to answer any additional questions after. So, summary. If we go back, again, this chapter is a little disjointed, but before you even put together your publication, or if you already have, I would encourage you to revisit your core values. They're really important because if you don't set them, they will be set by other people, or you may accidentally set core values that you don't even want to be true within your reader contract. Once you go to start a publication, you do need a stack, but what's important here is that most things work. So just choose one and move on. Focus on what you actually should be doing, which is providing value through your writing. The other thing is moving on to the paid or free concept. I think that's the bulk of what we talked about here, is that people are increasingly willing to pay for content. And that's because there is such a big sea of content now. It's harder to find the great content that they want to engage with. It's harder to find content that actually solves their problem. And so people are willing to pay if something's higher quality or better in some significant way, if they want to win back their time, if they want to support some sort of journalism or some individual or company. In determining if you want to charge for content, you really should take a bit of time to understand the pros and cons and not just jump into one or the other, and then map them out to your expectations or goals. So remember, if your goal is to create a big personal brand, that's very hard to do with a paid publication, and most of the people that have done it had an audience beforehand. Similarly, if your goal is to have a very, very deep connected relationship with your readers, then that's also hard to do with a free publication. So just consider what your expectations, what your goals are. Some of this may play into your core values as well. And then decide from there. Don't just jump into it based on seeing someone else having a paid publication or someone else having a free publication. If you do charge for content, make sure that, again, your stuff is going to be behind a paywall. So consider what your growth mechanism will be. And then you can have a hybrid approach where you have some free, some paid. If you choose to do that, make sure your paid is clearly delineated in some way. Again, we talked about, Dylan gave a couple examples where, not everyone does this, and some people manage to get by without clearly delineating. But I would argue that they come from a place where, they've already built up a huge audience, a huge dedicated audience often. And even people like Sam Harris probably could benefit from actually delineating their paid content, and he might even do better if he were to use that approach. And then finally, as we just talked about, the hardest part of all of this is actually the writing. And so again, don't spend so much time trying to decide on your tech stack, whether to be free or paid. You should spend time to build the foundations, but from there, the hard part actually starts at the writing. And writing well is not something, unfortunately, that I can teach you in a session like this. But spend time in investing in becoming a better writer over time, and that will be the best investment if you are actually planning to write your own publication. So I think that's it. And yeah, happy to stick around as long as you guys need me if you do have any final questions for this session.
Hey, thanks for that, Steph. That was very helpful.
No problem.
And apologies if this comes up later, Chapter 5 monetization. I know this is a long-term play. So how long before you get in that first dollar, and what does it actually look like?
Well, I think it really depends on your approach. And I know I feel like every answer to a question that starts with it depends is the worst. But so let me give you a couple examples. So if you are charging for your content immediately, your first dollar will come with your first subscriber, right? Which could come in the first week or so. If you are using other monetization approaches, which are discussed more in Chapter 5, including things like affiliates, including things like building your own products or courses, including donations, those tend to come later. And those come later because they are dependent on you building up an audience, right? And so I wouldn't say that with content, if we go back to the idea that, the content game is an amazing game, a hugely rewarding game at times, but also a long-term game, I wouldn't go into building a publication with the expectation that you were going to make much money for at least the first 6 months or so, maybe even a year. It obviously depends how much time you're investing in it, how dedicated you are, how well you do it. But I would say in general, you shouldn't expect a significant return from your writing for at least 6 months. And it really is this, similar to many other things in life, this exponential curve, where at the beginning it feels like, nothing's happening. And then eventually, like if you take my book, for example, I spent all of last year and most of this year working on my personal projects and my personal writing and things like that, and made basically nothing. And then I wrote this book, and, that's been very good to me, or good for me. But with writing, again, I would kind of approach it with this mindset of almost like an angel investment, where you're not expecting returns for a very long time.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Chris, for your comment in the chat. Any other questions, thoughts?
This is more a thought, but I
Sure.
heard Tim Ferriss, he talked a while back about the story where he had 2 houses. He was only living in one. And so he felt this guilt to rent out the other while he wasn't living there. But he didn't want to become a realtor. So he's like, I'll just eat that cost and make money elsewhere. I think that's kind of like having a newsletter where you don't have to monetize for a while. Just kind of focus on maybe your other job for as long as possible, and then come back once you have, I don't know, the audience there where it makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I can completely respect and empathize that certain people are in different financial situations where potentially writing a newsletter is their route to, financial stability and things like this. But it's very hard to do that in a short period of time. And to your point, Dylan, like the way I viewed it and what's actually been super beneficial for me is I've just done this on the side out of interest for a long time. And that's actually been really beneficial for me because and I wrote an article about exactly this, because I had a full-time job that was providing my financial stability. I was then able to put complete creative freedom into this other, outlet, which was my newsletter and my writing, in which case I wasn't writing stuff again just because I thought people might be interested in it, or because I thought it would be, would reap more financial returns or whatever. I really was just like, I want to write about this. I think it'll be useful. I don't know when this is going to pay off. But I think that actually ultimately ended up allowing me to be more successful, versus if you're approaching things from the point of view of like, this is my lifeline, you're going to make different decisions. You're going to, write about different things. You're going to probably monetize earlier, probably monetize for things that you maybe wouldn't monetize for if you have financial freedom. And so I'm not saying that one is right or wrong, but I've personally found, similar to the Tim Ferriss story, like, because this was a creative outlet for me where I wasn't forced to monetize very early, then I was actually able to focus on just doing what I loved and doing what I thought would bring value to people. And again, doesn't work for everyone, but that's really what I found valuable. All right. Any other thoughts, questions? If not, we can end this session. Just as a recap, this recording will be going up on to YouTube, as will the second session. So if you go to the YouTube recordings, there are timestamps for things that we cover, but also each session has different people ask different questions. So you're also welcome to jump into the recording for the other session and see what other questions were asked if you find that interesting. The slides are also available. There's this particular document that actually, if I stop sharing my screen, I'll pull this up and send it to everyone. That has all the details about all the live sessions, all of the recordings, etc. Here we go. All right, I just sent it. Oops, I accidentally sent it to someone privately. There we go, to everyone. So that will give you all the details about the live sessions, the recordings, and where you can sign up. Also a summary of each chapter. So thanks so much everyone for joining, especially those who joined 2 weeks in a row. Next week will be all about distribution, which I think will be mostly questions, because that section there's a lot in that section. So I don't think I'll cover as much of the content, and mostly just focus on questions for next week. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and hope to see you all next week. See ya.